Mr. Roberts, you spoke about the responsible use of AI in your opening comments. And so my question for you is, from your experience at the Joint AI Center, would you tell the committee more specifically about what responsible risk management actually looks like at each stage of the procurement process?
Yes, Senator, and I'll mention that it was an evolving process when I started in the JAIC. So we started with the two levels of trustworthiness, which was the trustworthiness and the functionality itself, whether it'll work, which created distrust. But the trustworthiness and the safety and responsible use became a big theme for us. And it started in the very planning phase, and this is the first instance that we noticed we had to have a more balanced team. So it wasn't like a relay race where the money, people sent it to the contracting and the program manager sent it over, and the testers and evaluators were at the very end. We needed to have the input from testing and evaluation from the ethics policy professionals and the end users at the very planning stage, so that the team worked more like a football team, where we all ran the ball down the field at the same time. This was a cultural change for us. This is not common in acquisition. We had to adjust accordingly for that. The two areas where we can provide the most meaningful value in the procurement process is in the evaluation phase and the testing phase. Evaluation, where we can make the responsible use of AI a discriminator for source selection, for award. And then the testing, of course, we can make as a metric for successful performance. This was challenging for us, though, because we didn't want to be too restrictive at the time. We wanted to bring in players and companies. So we started our efforts by turning it around to industry and asking them. We had 5 principles for responsible use of AI that Deputy Secretary of Defense released, and we asked them to give us a quality control plan of how they're going to live out those principles. And for the most part, it became this ongoing dialogue, since we were all in uncharted territory about how to do things responsibly. But I'll also mention that aside from some specific projects, especially those that dealt with health and warfighting, so much of our projects had low risk in terms of responsible use. We were able to talk with our ethics person, and they were able to weigh the risks. But for those that were high risk, we treaded carefully, and we worked hand in hand with industry, especially making sure that when the contract was created, the post-award performance, which is where it really matters, was all set up to make sure that as this AI was being delivered, it was being done in a responsible way.
Great. Thank you, Ms. Raj. Right now, we're hearing from our federal procurement officers that they're basically being bombarded by companies wanting to demonstrate the promise of their products, and they have no shortage of promises that they are presenting. My question for you is, how can we ensure that the federal agencies avoid being caught up in what's clearly AI hype right now around the country, and spend taxpayer money responsibly on services that will actually deliver tangible results for the American people?
Thank you, Senator, for your question. As a former small business owner, we have to continuously rise against the same noise to provide the best quality computer vision for our customers. We first started working with the US government in 2017, and in 2017, we were one of the handful of Silicon Valley companies working with the US government. Now we see large tech companies with massive internal resources, or a handful of companies that are being massively funded by venture capitalists in the hopes that they could land meaningful contracts from the US government in AI. So I think I've got 2 points. The first is point 1 and 3 of my oral testimony. For federal agencies looking to bring in AI technology, it is important to have data sets that are curated and readily available not during the contracting solicitation time, as well as during when the contracting is evaluated. Models can be benchmarked even before the technology can be acquired. Often when we worked on contracts, waiting for government furnished data was the longest lead time on contracts. So for faster evaluation, the less taxpayer money is spent. I want to commend NGA. They've been doing a great job getting their data ready for AI. And then secondly, to your point, right, anyone can download AI models off the internet and claim AI expertise. So again, having testing and evaluation data sets ready, both at the contracting process and throughout the entire execution of the contract, it'll make it easier for procurement officials to be able to both find and evaluate tech through quantitative and qualitative means.
Great, thank you. Dr. Lee, as legislators work to establish key values for the American use of AI, the idea of explainability has received substantial attention. However, building responsibility and trust into the use of AI seems like it's going to require more than just an understanding of the math behind a model. Could you offer some specific suggestions as to how we ought to prioritize when evaluating AI systems for potential use by federal agencies?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Actually, explainability is a very much used word in the talks of AI. If we think about it, it's actually a very nuanced word. I'll give you an example that's not AI. For example, you talk about math. You know, when a bottle drops, we can actually use Newtonian mathematical equation to explain why the bottle drops. But when it comes to the usage of Tylenol, other than some doctors and biomedical researchers, even as a consumer, I don't know how to explain Tylenol works. Yet there is an explainable process of how federal government has regulated so that I can trust it. Or another example of using Google Map to go from point A to point B. There, the explainability is not in mathematical equations, nor in regulatory framework. It's more about the options it has provided to me, the fastest route or the avoid the tolls, and so on. I'm using these three examples to show you explainability is a very nuanced term, and depend on the use cases, it depends on the system approach. We have to think about it carefully. And again, I advocate for a systematic approach and thinking about explainability, but do put the human values as well as our society's value at foreground of this. And depending on how we use it, will require different kind of explainability.
Mr. Ghani, what do you see as essential provisions of contracts involving AI systems that governments are not currently incorporating and should be required?
I think simply what the majority of the procurement process I've seen, it over-focuses on the mechanics of the system being procured. And so I'll give you an example. Many years ago, I was working with police departments on these systems called early intervention systems that were designed to identify police officers who were going to use unjustified force and shootings and detect them early. When you look at procurement documents, RFPs for systems, what they talked about was measuring what is the uptime of the system? Can people log into the system? Does it show up, as opposed to the truly functional requirements, which are, does it reduce police shootings? Does it prevent those shootings? Does it help save people's lives? So what's happening is that the focus has been on the mechanics because it's easy to do. It's easy to measure. It doesn't require that much thinking and effort. And so we do the easy thing and we forget the hard stuff. There are many such other examples where we've got contracts that we get stuck into that are unnecessarily long-term. We don't allow the systems to get data out and put more data in. We don't have them interoperate because, as we talked about, AI systems don't work in isolation. They're connected to different pieces. There's a lack of customization and configuration. And I think that there's a whole series of things. So what we need to do is create a much more holistic procurement process that has both requirements around what did you design the system to do? How did you do it so that how did you validate that it did what you wanted it to do? And how are you developing a continuous monitoring process that's continuing to do so? And most of those things, there are no standards that exist today for that procurement, and we need to create those.
So a follow-up on that, maybe others were nodding their heads, this is important. So what those requirements are, then the other question is, can we standardize those requirements across a variety of government agencies, or does it have to be more niche? You want to take the first stab at that, then I see Ms. Raj, you're nodding your head too, so your thoughts on that, and any others that want to jump in. But Mr. Ghani.
I think it's going to have to be an 80-20 thing here, where there's a series of things that we can standardize. And what we can standardize on is, what do we ask for? We can standardize, we need to figure out what values the system is built on. We need to figure out how you built it. What design choices did you build? What artifacts were produced? Does it work for people? Who does it work for? Who does it not work for? How was it validated? Those are kind of high-level questions that we can standardize that need to be there. Data in, data out, interoperability, configuration. What we cannot standardize on is what specific values it should have. That needs to come from the use case, right? So, and that's where that collaboration is going to happen, is people with expertise in understanding the policy issue. And, we're talking about service delivery. What is the goal of that service? Is it to improve people's lives, or is it to save money? When there's a trade-off, who decides that? The questions that we were talking about earlier, those are the things that are not going to be standard. They're going to depend on the specific use case and specific policy and the specific service. But everything, the process that was used to design that system, to come up with those values and to validate it and all the other things, those can be standardized. So again, I think it's going to be an 80-20 thing, where 80% can be standardized and 20% will need to be customized.
Great. And if anyone else has thoughts, but Ms. Raj, you have some thoughts.
Yeah, thank you, Senator Peters, for your question. So at a high level, I think we could also think about it from the other way, which is what data is available for AI to tackle from a low-hanging fruit perspective, right? So I think there's a way to organize, hey, this is the data that's available that potentially can be used for automation. This is the level of kind of the responsible AI that can be applied to these particular questions. And so perhaps getting AI slowly integrated via, this is the data available, and these are the questions that there are more guardrails around. That could be a good way to start the standardization process. Because starting standards without actually tying it to specific use cases and mission need, then you'll have that misalignment.
Mr. Roberts?
Yes, Senator, I'll piggyback on something Professor Ghani said too about obsessing over the mechanics in terms of valuing the performance. This is why it's so important for acquisition professionals to be mission-focused and look at AI as an enhancement of the mission, because it is so easy to, as Professor Ghani mentioned, to measure performance based on mechanics, based on how is it working rather than is it working? Is it actually valuable to the end user? When you have a focus on that, I think you find that the acquisition team changes the way they approach even risks and responsible use of AI. They change the way they look at the intellectual property. It all focuses on mission value and value to end user, which trickles down into the way we look at everything.
Very good. Professor Ghani, back to you. We've heard previously about the need to audit AI systems to account for drift and unintended consequences. My question for you is, what procedures should be put in place to audit the government and or these AI systems within the government? And should this need be accounted for upfront in the procurement process? And if so, how?
If so, absolutely, yes. I think the audit has to be there. And I think there are, in my mind, there are three stages of this audit, right? The first audit, and I think I keep going back to, and we're all sort of saying the same word, values, right? When we're designing a system, the procurement has to ask for a system to help achieve certain values. We need to audit those and validate whether those are the values we actually care about. That's the first audit. That's not a technical audit, that's a values audit. Number two is, when a system is being procured, we need to audit whether it was, how did the vendor, consultant, researcher build this system to help it achieve those values. So that's a technical audit. Three, once it's deployed, it's not gonna work in isolation. In most cases, it is informing, especially high-stakes decisions, it's informing humans. And so you can audit the system for what it outputs, but we need to audit, how does it interact with this person, and how does this human decisions change? Because that's eventually what we care about, is impact on people. So we need to audit the interaction between the AI system and the human system, and then audit the outcomes that it produces. So those are the four pieces, and it's not a one-off, it's a continuous thing because it's going to change.
Good. Mr. Roberts, how can the government ensure that the data that's used for testing and training the government's AI platforms is actually secure and protected? And anyone else can jump in on these too, so, but I'll pick out one individual, but feel free if you want to say anything to raise your hand as we wrap up. Only a couple more questions and then you'll be free. Mr. Roberts.
Yes, Senator, I'll start by saying that the more we restrict the free flow of data and access from contractors to the data, there's also a sense in which that becomes more problematic as well, especially for the functioning of the model. So we've seen instances just on the other side of over-classification, over-regulation, over-protection of data that has killed projects. However, having said that, data security, protection, and privacy, it's essential, especially in areas that I've worked with the classified data that affects national security and personally identifiable information, especially with health records. We've seen some things that have helped, especially with health records. The use of synthetic data was beneficial to us that we were able to use. So there's other sources of data, but not to oversimplify, I think that the most important thing for the acquisition field is to put the ethics professional, the person who is dealing with privacy, the security professional, into the planning phase. Again, having a balanced team that has all these professionals involved at the very beginning. Supply chain risk is another big problem with security. It's something that's not looked at much. And what we're finding with AI is a lot of these rules, such as supply chain risk, were always rules, but they're re-emerging in much more important ways when we're looking at AI. The risks, the adversarial threats. So it's looking at all these risks in new ways, and it's making sure you have a full, balanced team to be with you at the planning stage on how to deal with it.
Right. Ms. Raj?
Yeah, I want to talk about it from the perspective of small business. CrowdAI has worked with the US government on AI initiatives on a wide range of sensors, all unclassified. As we move forward and mature, we started working with more of the, with DCSA to make sure that we could be ready for other types of data, more sensitive data. Many systems that we worked with US government data were either on bare metal servers or data that remained in government clouds. So I believe that it is important that if a company that's in dual use wants to work with the US government, they also need to ensure that the data is treated with responsibility and privacy to the maximum extent possible. I think that as companies start putting their technology in a more dual use manner, they also need to comply with privacy and regulation that is so standard across a lot of large companies. And AI is an ever-evolving technology, and so the way you make sure that companies of all sizes continue this type of evaluation around privacy and ethics is making sure that there's qualitative and quantitative testing, because often aggregated statistics may not paint the full picture.